Hey everyone, hope you all are doing great. Today we will be talking about state implementation in ReactJS. In React, state or a piece of state is nothing but a JavaScript object, a simple JavaScript object in which we store information about a component. For example, let's say you have a login component where you are asking the user to enter their email and password. So these two things, that is the email and password, are information about your login component, and thus you will be storing them in your state. And in React we use two types of components, that is functional and class based, and in this video we will be learning and going through about how we can implement state in both of them. So let's get started. So in order to understand state implementation in React, we will be creating a state counter which will be implemented in both class based component and functional based component. So the first thing you will be needing for this is a React app, which you can create using the create React app CLI. So I have already created my React app and done the cleanup process. And if you don't know what the cleanup process is, it is basically removing the unnecessary files like the test files which we have here, because we no longer need them. And inside app.js I have removed all the code and replaced it with a p tag which says this is the state counter. And I've also created a components folder which contains two JavaScript files. First is state with class and the second is state with functions, in which we will be creating class based components and in the second functional component. So we will be starting off with a class component. So I will be using something called React Snippets to initialize my class. And if you don't know what React Snippets are, you can go ahead in extensions and search for React Snippets, and the first extension you should see is the ES7 React Redux Snippets. You can go ahead and download this. This will help you save a lot of time in writing code. So you can open up your state with class.js file and write in RCC, which stands for React Class Component, and you can hit enter. So this will create a template for you. Now you just need to change the name of the component, so it will be state with class, and inside here we will, just for checking if this thing works, we will add a p tag which says this is a class component. Now we can save this file, and in order to see if this works, we need to call this component in app.js. So we will quickly import this. Import, the name was state with class from dot slash components, there you go, / state with class, and we will remove this p and we will call this method, this component state with class, and we will hit save. And if we open up our browser, we can see this is a class component, which means this is working. So now let's close the app.js and stick here. So we will be creating the structure of our counter. So the structure would be pretty simple. We will have a p tag which will contain the number of our counter, and below that we will have a button which will say click me, which will be incrementing our counter. So if we just save it and see, we can see the structure would be pretty simple like this, and I will not be styling this because that is not what we are here for. So let's talk about state. So as I mentioned earlier, state in React is nothing but a JavaScript object which contains information about that component. And so for us in this component, information is this counter. So we need a piece of state which will have a variable to keep a track of what our current counter is. So in order to initialize state, you do something like this. So you write in state equal to an empty object. So that's it. So this is the initialization for a class based component, and in here you can write your properties. For example, we need a counter, so we will give it a name. So let's say my counter. You can name it whatever you want. So my counter, and just like any normal object, you will assign it a value. So this value will be the default value when your component gets mounted. So we will initialize it with 0. Now since our state is already initialized, we can use my counter variable instead of hard-coded this hard-coded one. So in order to use it, we wrap any JavaScript that if you want to use any JavaScript inside of return, you wrap it in curly brackets. So you write curly brackets, and in order to access my counter, you write this, which refers to our current component dot state dot my counter. And if you hit save and open up your browser, you should see 0. Now this is your piece of state. This is your counter values. So, and if you change it, let's say we make it 12 and hit save, and we open our browser again, so you will see it is 12. So now instead of manually updating our piece of state, we want this functionality to be handled by our button. So every time we click on the button, it should increment our counter. So in order to do that, let's go back to our code, and we will need an on-click event for our button. So we'll write on-click, and we will call a method here. So in order to call a method in class-based components, we write this, which refers to the current component, and dot the method name. So in this case, our method name would be handle counter change. Now this method does not exist yet, so we will create it. So, and this will be an arrow function, so that it is easier for us to handle the state. We will be covering why we are using arrow functions instead of the normal functions where we use the function keyword in a bit. So let's continue with our state update. So every time a button is clicked, we want our state to update. So let's change this back to 0. And so in order to update your state in function and class-based components, there is something called set state. So in order to use that, we say this dot set state, and it is a function, and it takes an object as a parameter, and inside this object we will say what changes do we want to do. So in our case, we want to change my counter, so we will say my counter would be changed to, let's say, 5. So what this statement right here means, that set the state and change my counter's value to whatever it was, change it to 5, right? So whenever I click this button, my counter will be updated with the value of 5. If we go ahead and save it and check it, so now if we click on the button, it says 5, right? And one more concept you need to know in React is that whenever you update your state, React detects those changes, and every time your state updates, React re-renders your entire piece of code for that particular component, right? So initially we had 0 in my counter, so in the p tag we had 0, and when we clicked on this button, our state got updated. React detected that state change, and it re-rendered, or we can say in simple words, reran this entire piece of code again. So now your my counter is no longer holding the value of 0, it is now holding the value of 5. So that's why you saw the real-time data change from 0 to 5. So this is called React re-rendering. So every time you update your state or make any changes, your component will be re-rendered with updated value, right? So now in order we don't want to hard code this to something, so what we need to do is we need to set it to whatever our current counter value is plus 1, so that it will increment. So in order to access my counter, what can we do? So just like we access my counter in our p tag, we will do the same here also. So we'll say this dot state dot my counter. So now we have access to my counter's current value, which is 0 right now, and so we will add 1 to it. So now this entire expression says take the current value of my counter and add 1 to it. So current value is 0, so it will say 0 plus 1, so it will change it to 1. So let's go ahead and save it and try it. So it says 0, so it should increment now. So when we click, it says 0 plus 1 is 1. Click it again, 1 plus 1 is 2, and we keep on clicking, it keeps on incrementing. So that's how you use state in a class based component. So let's quickly go through the entire piece of code again. So let's go to the first step was state initialization. So in order to initialize your state in a class based component, you do this. You write state equal to an object, and inside that object you write your properties. The second step, the second concept that we learned today is how to access your piece of code, piece of state in your HTML tags or in your JSX. So now in order to do that, what we did is used something called this. So this keyword, which refers to our current component, and we called this dot state, which refers to our piece of state right here, right? And inside this dot state we called my counter, which is right here. So instead of my counter, you could have a different piece of states. You could have let's say you could have a name which is initialized with an empty string. You could have someone's phone number, which you might be taking as input from a user. You even might have some data which will be initialized with an empty array or an empty object, whatever the case may be, and this data you might be updating this piece of state from an API, right? So you can use states for fulfilling multiple purposes. So in this case, we just use a simple concept of incrementing our counter. So, and the final concept that we went through was how to update our states. So in order to update states in class based components, we use something called this dot set state. And what set state does is it is a method first of all, and it takes an object as a parameter, which you can see here right here, and we tell it inside this object, we tell what updates do we want to do. So we said we want to update my counter with this new value. So set state updated our piece of state, right? And whenever we change or update our state, React detects it, and it causes our component to re-render. This piece of code will rerun every time you change your state, right? But that is only the case when you are using set state, because set state is meant for this purpose only. It is created for this purpose only. Now you also might say, let's comment this out for a second, and you might try to update your state like this dot state dot my counter. You can access it like this, right? And equals to 5. You might try this, which will definitely update the state. But when you save it, you can see that React automatically gives you a warning that you should not mutate state directly. In this case, you are updating the state directly, which is not recommended by React. You should use set state. So that is the reason we use set state. And one more reason is, if you're updating state like this, it will definitely cause some complications in your code, and plus it will also not cause any re-rendering. So if you update your state like this, let's save it and give it a try. So when you click on this button, it should update your state, and your updated value should appear here, right? So let's see if that actually works. So let's click on the button. So we clicked on the button, but 0 did not change. Our state got updated, but it didn't cause a re-render because we mutated the state, or we changed the state directly. So that is the reason why we should be using set state only. So now if we go ahead and give it a try and click on it, it gets updated, right? And so this is the best practice. Best practice is using set state and not mutating states, because that will definitely cause some complications in your code. So so this is the entire class based state implementation. One more thing I missed is, earlier I mentioned why that we're using arrow functions and not the normal functions in which we have function keywords. So why is that? The reason for that is, if we try to change it, let's say we call it a function and we call it like this, or we can remove this. Yeah, so let's say this is a normal function, right? This is how we're taught functions should be declared. So if we try this, let's try this, and if we click on it, you can see it crashed. It says cannot read property set state of undefined, right? And set state of undefined, so it basically is saying that this keyword is undefined, it is not defined. So whenever you're using normal functions like this, you have to keep in mind that you cannot access this here, right? So this, in order to access state, you need to bind this function right here to your state. But since we got arrow functions, we no longer need to do that, because binding can be a little complicated for new people, right? So instead of using these normal functions, we started using arrow functions. So this is the syntax for arrow function. You say that it is equal to a set of parentheses, a set of round brackets, and arrow, and then your curly brackets. So in arrow functions, you do not need to do any binding, right? So you can directly use this keyword, which will refer to your global state or your component right there. So this is the reason you should be if you're using class-based components and you're working with states, you should, if you're using the normal functions, you will have to bind them to a class. Otherwise, if you're using arrow functions, you don't need to do that. So arrow functions make it much easier to use states and class-based components. So that was the entire class-based component state implementation. We will be jumping on to functional components in a bit. So let's talk about functional components. So here I will be using React Snippet for creating my template. So you're gonna type RFC, which stands for React Functional Component, and hit enter. So this will create a functional component template for you, and we will quickly create our structure, in which we have a p tag for our counter and a button right below it, which will say click me, and let's add a functional text right next to it, so that we know that it is from our functional component. Let's save it and let's go back to app.js. We will remove our import and import our new component, which will be state with function from components / state with function, and we will replace state with state with function, and let's hit save. So if you open up our browser, we can see it says click me with functional, and nothing happens on clicking because we haven't done anything yet. So let's go back to our functional component, and let's talk about how can we use state inside a functional component. So earlier, state was only for class-based components. Functional components are known as stateless components because we were not able to use states inside a functional component. But with the introduction of React hooks, we are now able to use states in our functional components as well. So what you want to do is, like, we can remove React because we are not doing anything with React. So you're gonna type import. We're gonna import a hook called use state. Okay, so whatever hooks we have in React, they all start with the use keyword. So in order to we want to use state, so the hook is called use state. So we're going to import that from React, and the syntax for how you use it, how you initialize your piece of state, is as follows. So you write const square brackets. In this square brackets, take two parameters, right? So we're going to type two things here. The first thing would be the name of our state. In this case, we're going to call it my counter. Let's call it my counter only. So we got my counter, comma, and the next thing is basically a method. a method which will be used to update this piece of state, right? So by convention it goes as follows: you type set followed by your state name, whatever you declared here. So I'm going to copy that and paste it right here. So this is a my counter and set my counter. The my counter contains the value of my counter, and set my counter is a method which we will use in order to update my counter. So let's complete the syntax. This will be equal to use state, and inside this parenthesis we will assign it a default value. So let's call it 0. Okay, so let's go over the statement one more time. So inside the square brackets we have two things. The first one is the name of our state variable, in this case my counter, and the second thing is a function which we will be using to update the value of my counter. And we initialize it with use state, and we give it an initial value. Now in order to access it inside our p tag, what we can do is, similar to a state component, we will use curly brackets, and inside curly brackets, unlike the class components, we do not use this keyword. We do not have any concept of this keyword in functional components, so we can directly pick my counter and paste it here. So now if you go ahead and save and open up your browser, it should say 0. So this is your piece of state in functional component. Now you can update it to 10, and let's save and see if it gets updated. So you can see it gets changed. Let's move it back to 0. Now similar to the class based component, we need to assign an on click event which will be handle counter change. Now unlike class based components, we will not be using the this keyword here, so we will directly give our function name here. Now let's declare our function. So const function would be an arrow function, right? And inside this arrow function we need to update the value of our counter, right? So instead of this dot set state, now we have a dedicated method which will control the value of our counter, right? So we can directly call this method. This is a method, so we will call it, and inside we will give the updated value, right? So if I say 5, so whenever you click on this button, this method will get called, and set my counter will update my counter's value to whatever we pass in here. So let's save and try, right? So again the process of re-rendering will happen here also, because we are updating a piece of state. So click me and it changes to 5. So now the same concept, we don't want it to we don't want to hard code it, so we will take my counter, whatever the value of my counter currently is, and we will add 1 to it. So our expression becomes whatever the current value of my counter is plus 1. Now if we save it and try, right? Okay, let's refresh the page once more. So current value is 0, and if I click, it becomes 1. Click again 2, and it keeps on incrementing, right? So that is how you do the implementation of state in a functional component. Let's go over the code one more time. So in order to use state in functional components, we use a hook, a React hook called useState. Now how is useState different from this dot state in class based components? Let's try to figure that out. So let us compare the differences, right? So in here we have one piece of state in which we can have multiple variables. For example, my counter, we can have a name, we can have password, we can have email, we can have a variety of things, right? And in order to access, let's say password, we can just write this dot state dot password, right? But in here we can have multiple piece of states, right? We can have a state for my counter, we can have a state for name. So it will be name comma set name, right? And we can initialize with an empty string, right? So we have two states here, so one for my counter and one for name, whereas in class based components we have one piece of state which contains all our properties, right? So that is one difference between the functional component and class component state management. But we can also achieve this thing in a functional component. Let's see how. So instead of declaring individual states, what we can do is change this to, let's say, state, okay, and this would be set state, right? And we will assign it initial value of an object like we do here, right? So we can exactly copy this and paste it here. So now this thing will act in a similar manner like this, right? So below this we can add our name, phone number, whatever we want, right? So now in order, how will we update our state? Now what we need to do is we need to call set state first thing. So first thing we will need to change is the p tag. So we are calling my counter, but my counter does not exist, right? So in order to access my counter we need to go through state. So you will say state.myCounter. That is how you will access my counter. And when you want to change that counter, what will you do? So you will say, let's remove this, you will say set state, and inside set state we need to pass in the new values, right? This entire object. So we can just copy and paste it, right? So my counter, we will update this. So we will say state dot my counter plus 1. So as you can see, this is very much similar to this now, right? But in functional components you get you get to decide if you want to follow this this approach, or you want to have separate states for my counter and the rest of your fields, right? So this thing will also work. So if you are comfortable with using this approach, you can replicate it in functional components like this, right? So this should also work in the similar manner. So if we check it, if we go back to our browser, let's hard reload this and click, you can see it works just in the same manner, right? So that was how you can, let's remove this, yeah. So that was how we can implement state management in a class based component and as well as a functional component. So, and if you have any doubts, or if you found anything that I was not able to explain correctly, please do comment in the comment section and I will get back to you. And if you have any feedbacks, all feedbacks are welcome. Any type of constructive criticism is welcome in the comment section. Thank you very much.